Sarah Martinez adjusted her coffee shop apron for the third time that morning, making sure it covered the intricate tattoo that wrapped around her right forearm. The Memorial Day weekend rush was about to begin, and she knew the small-town cafe would be packed with tourists and locals celebrating the holiday. At 24, Sarah had been working at Murphy's Corner Cafe for 2 years, saving every penny she could while attending community college part-time. The tattoo hidden beneath her sleeve told a story that most people in Millbrook didn't know. It was a detailed military memorial piece featuring dog tags, combat boots, a rifle, and a helmet arranged in the traditional battlefield cross formation. Woven through the design were names and dates, along with coordinates that marked specific locations in Afghanistan. The artwork was beautiful and meaningful, created by one of the best tattoo artists in the state, but Sarah had learned to keep it covered after too many uncomfortable conversations and judgmental stares. The morning crowd began filtering in around 8 o'clock. Sarah moved efficiently between tables, taking orders and serving the regular customers she had come to know well. Mrs. Henderson ordered her usual black coffee and blueberry muffin, while Tom from the hardware store grabbed his large coffee with extra cream before heading to work. The atmosphere was cheerful, with red, white, and blue decorations adorning the walls and patriotic music playing softly in the background. Everything changed when the temperature started climbing near noon. Sarah had been rushing between the kitchen and dining room, carrying heavy trays and working up a sweat in the warm cafe. Without thinking, she pushed up her sleeves to cool down, completely forgetting about keeping her tattoo hidden. She was wiping down a table near the window when she heard the first snicker. "Look at that," whispered Janet Morrison, a woman in her 50s who came in occasionally with her book club friends. "What kind of girl gets something like that permanently marked on her body? It's so aggressive." Sarah's cheeks burned as she pretended not to hear, but the damage was done. Other customers began to notice, and the whispers grew louder. She quickly pulled her sleeve down, but it was too late. The judgment had already begun. "I just don't understand young people today," said another woman, shaking her head disapprovingly. "Getting tattoos of weapons and war. It's not appropriate for a lady, especially someone working in food service. What if children see that?" A man at a nearby table chimed in. "Probably thinks it makes her look tough or something. These kids watch too many action movies. Real war isn't a game." Sarah felt her hands trembling as she continued cleaning tables, trying to ignore the growing murmur of disapproval. The beautiful artwork that held such deep meaning for her was being reduced to a conversation piece for people who didn't understand. She had worked so hard to build a good reputation at the cafe, and now she worried that everything would change. The comments continued throughout the lunch rush. Some customers made their opinions known directly, while others simply stared and whispered among themselves. Sarah noticed that several people seemed uncomfortable being served by her, asking for other staff members when possible. The weight of their judgment felt crushing, and she began to question whether she should have ever gotten the tattoo in the first place. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah retreated more and more into herself. She kept her sleeves pulled down despite the heat and avoided making eye contact with customers when possible. The joy she usually felt at work was replaced by anxiety and embarrassment. She found herself checking the clock frequently, counting the hours until her shift would end. Around 3 o'clock, the lunch crowd began to thin out, but the whispers and stares continued. Sarah was refilling napkin dispensers when she overheard a particularly harsh conversation between 2 middle-aged men who had been drinking coffee and sharing dessert for the past hour. "I served 2 tours overseas," one of them said loudly, clearly intending for Sarah to hear. "And I can tell you that real veterans don't need to advertise it with flashy tattoos. That girl probably got it because she thought it looked cool or edgy. She has no idea what that imagery actually represents." His companion nodded in agreement. "It's disrespectful, if you ask me." Young people today have no understanding of sacrifice or service. They just want to look like rebels without actually earning the right to wear those symbols. Sarah's heart sank even further. The accusation that she was being disrespectful cut deeper than any of the other comments. If only they knew the truth, she thought. If only they understood what each element of her tattoo represented and why she had chosen to carry those memories with her always. The afternoon seemed to stretch on forever. Sarah found herself making mistakes she never usually made, mixing up orders and forgetting to refill drinks. Her usual confidence was completely shaken, and she began to wonder if she would need to find a new job. The thought of facing this kind of judgment every day was overwhelming. As evening approached and the cafe began to empty out, Sarah finally allowed herself to breathe a little easier. She was looking forward to going home, taking a long shower, and trying to forget about the terrible day. But just as she was beginning to clean up for closing, the bell above the door chimed one more time. A man in his 60s entered the cafe, wearing a simple button-down shirt and khaki pants. He had short gray hair and carried himself with a distinctly military bearing. His posture was straight, his movements precise, and his eyes alert as he surveyed the room. Sarah groaned internally, expecting more of the same judgment she had faced all day. The man approached the counter where Sarah was working and smiled politely. "Good evening," he said in a clear, commanding voice. "I'd like a large black coffee and a slice of that apple pie, if you have any left." Sarah nodded and moved to prepare his order, keeping her sleeves carefully pulled down. She could feel his eyes watching her as she worked, and she braced herself for another uncomfortable interaction. But the man simply waited patiently, seemingly lost in thought. As she handed him his coffee and pie, their hands briefly touched, and the man's eyes seemed to focus more intently on her. For a moment, Sarah thought she saw something like recognition in his expression, but she quickly dismissed the idea. She was probably just being paranoid after the day she'd had. The man found a table near the back of the cafe and sat down to enjoy his coffee and pie. Sarah continued her closing routine, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her. Unlike the other customers that day, however, his attention didn't feel judgmental or hostile. It felt more like curiosity, as if he was trying to figure something out. As the last few customers filtered out and Sarah began wiping down tables, she noticed that the older man was still there, seemingly in no hurry to leave. When she approached his table to clear his dishes, he looked up at her with kind but serious eyes. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "I couldn't help but notice earlier that you have some ink on your arm. Mind if an old soldier takes a look?" Sarah's heart began racing again. This was exactly what she had been trying to avoid all day. But something in the man's tone made her pause. He hadn't called it a tattoo like everyone else. He had called it ink, the way military people often did. And he had identified himself as a soldier, not just someone with opinions about military imagery. Reluctantly, Sarah rolled up her sleeve, revealing the detailed memorial tattoo. She watched the man's face carefully, expecting to see the same disapproval she had encountered all day. Instead, his expression grew very serious, and he leaned forward to study the artwork more closely. After a long moment of silence, the man looked back up at Sarah with something that looked like respect in his eyes. "That's beautiful work," he said softly, "and very meaningful. Tell me, what's the story behind it?" For the first time all day, someone was asking about her tattoo with genuine interest rather than judgment. Sarah felt a mix of relief and nervousness as she prepared to share the truth that she had been hiding for so long. Sarah took a deep breath and glanced around the nearly empty cafe. The few remaining customers were absorbed in their own conversations, giving her the privacy she needed to tell her story. She looked back at the older man, whose patient expression encouraged her to continue. "My brother Danny was a Marine," Sarah began, her voice barely above a whisper. He enlisted right after high school when I was still in middle school. He always said he wanted to serve his country and make a difference in the world. Danny was the kind of person who couldn't stand by and watch others suffer. When he heard about what was happening overseas, he knew he had to go. The man nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face as she spoke. His expression remained serious but kind, encouraging her to continue sharing what was clearly a difficult story. Danny deployed to Afghanistan when I was a sophomore in high school. We wrote letters back and forth constantly. He would tell me about the people he met, the children who would wave at the convoys, and how much the humanitarian missions meant to him. He was part of a unit that helped build schools and distribute medical supplies to remote villages. Danny always focused on the positive things they were doing, never the dangerous parts. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued, finding comfort in sharing memories she rarely spoke about aloud. He made friends with everyone in his unit. There was Rodriguez, who came from a family of Marines and could make anyone laugh even in the worst situations. Jenkins was the medic who carried pictures of his 3 daughters everywhere he went. Morrison was the communications specialist who spoke 4 languages and helped translate for the local interpreters. And their squad leader, Sergeant Thompson, who had been in the Corps for 12 years and treated all his Marines like family. The older man's expression had grown even more serious as Sarah mentioned the names, and she noticed his hands had tightened slightly around his coffee cup. But he remained silent, allowing her to tell her story at her own pace. Danny's second deployment was when everything changed, Sarah continued, her voice beginning to waver slightly. They were assigned to a forward operating base in Helmand Province. The coordinates you see in my tattoo mark that exact location. It was supposed to be a routine mission, escorting a convoy of supplies to a village that had requested help setting up a water purification system. Sarah paused and rolled up her sleeve a little further, pointing to specific elements of the tattoo. See these dog tags? Each one has the name and service number of one of Danny's squad members. The coordinates here mark not just their base, but the exact location where their convoy was hit by an improvised explosive device on March 15, 2019. The cafe had grown completely quiet, except for the soft hum of the coffee machines and the distant sound of traffic outside. Sarah could see that the man was hanging on every word, his military bearing evident in how intently he listened to her story. Danny was the only survivor, Sarah said, her voice breaking slightly. He spent 8 months in military hospitals, first in Germany and then at Walter Reed. He had lost his left leg below the knee and suffered traumatic brain injury from the blast. But the physical injuries weren't the worst part. Danny blamed himself for surviving when his brothers didn't make it home. The man reached across the table and gently touched Sarah's hand, a gesture of comfort from someone who clearly understood the weight of what she was sharing. When Danny finally came home, he wasn't the same person who had left. He struggled with survivor's guilt, depression, and PTSD. He would wake up screaming from nightmares, and some days he wouldn't get out of bed at all. Our family tried everything to help him. We got him into therapy, support groups, and various treatment programs. Sometimes he would seem to be getting better, but then something would trigger a memory, and he would spiral down again. Sarah wiped away a tear that had started to form in the corner of her eye. The tattoo was actually Danny's idea originally. He wanted to get a memorial piece for his fallen squad members, something that would honor their memory and keep them with him always. We spent months designing it together, researching the symbolism and making sure every detail was perfect. But Danny never got the chance to have it done. The man's expression had grown very somber, and Sarah could see understanding dawning in his eyes. He seemed to know where the story was heading, but he remained silent, allowing her to continue. Danny died by suicide 18 months after he came home, Sarah said quietly. He left a note saying he couldn't live with the guilt anymore and wanted to be reunited with his brothers. In the note, he asked me to get the tattoo we had designed together, so that his squad would never be forgotten and so that part of him would live on through me. The silence that followed was profound. The man sat back in his chair, clearly processing the full weight of Sarah's story. His eyes returned to the tattoo with new understanding, seeing not just artwork but a living memorial to fallen heroes and a sister's love for her brother. "So when people look at my tattoo and see something aggressive or inappropriate," Sarah continued, "they don't understand that every line represents a life lost in service to our country. They don't know that Rodriguez died trying to pull Jenkins to safety, or that Morrison used his body to shield a local interpreter who was traveling with them. They don't know that Sergeant Thompson died calling in medical evacuation for his wounded Marines, or that my brother lived every day afterward wishing he had died with them." The man nodded slowly, his respect for Sarah's story evident in his expression. "And the people today," he said quietly, "they made assumptions without knowing the truth." "They always do," Sarah replied. "I've heard every comment you can imagine. That it's not appropriate for a woman, that I'm trying to look tough, that I'm disrespecting military imagery by using it as decoration. One man today even said that real veterans don't advertise their service with flashy tattoos, and that I probably just thought it looked cool." The older man's jaw tightened slightly at this last comment, and Sarah could see something shift in his expression. "Is that right?" he said, his voice taking on a slightly different tone. "Someone said real veterans don't advertise their service?" "Yes, sir," Sarah said. "He claimed he had served 2 tours overseas and said I had no idea what that imagery actually represents. He called it disrespectful and said young people today have no understanding of sacrifice or service." The man was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. Finally, he looked back up at Sarah with an expression that was both kind and determined. "Sarah," he said, using her name, although she couldn't remember telling him what it was, "I want you to know that your tattoo is one of the most meaningful and respectful tributes I've ever seen. The fact that you carry the memory of your brother and his fallen comrades with you every day shows a level of honor and commitment that many people could never understand." Sarah felt tears forming again, this time from relief and gratitude rather than sadness. For the first time all day, someone truly understood the significance of what she carried on her arm. "I have a feeling," the man continued with a slight smile, "that tomorrow might be a very different day for you here at the cafe. Sometimes people need to have their perspectives adjusted, and I believe I might be able to help with that." Sarah wasn't sure what he meant by that comment, but something in his tone suggested that the man was more than just a sympathetic stranger who happened to understand military culture. There was an authority in his voice and a confidence in his statement that made her think he might have more influence than his casual appearance suggested. As the man stood to leave, he reached into his wallet and left a generous tip on the table. "Thank you for sharing Danny's story with me, Sarah. And thank you for honoring his memory and the memory of his brothers the way you do. They would be proud." After he left, Sarah finished cleaning up the cafe, but her mind was racing with questions about the mysterious stranger. Who was he, and how did he know her name? What had he meant about tomorrow being different? And why had his presence made her feel more understood and respected than she had felt in months? As she locked up the cafe and headed home that evening, Sarah had no idea that her encounter with the older man would change everything. She couldn't have imagined that by the next morning the entire town would have a very different understanding of who she was and what her tattoo really represented. Sarah arrived at Murphy's Corner Cafe the next morning with a heavy heart, dreading another day of whispered comments and judgmental stares. She had barely slept, replaying the previous day's events and the mysterious conversation with the older man. As she tied her apron and prepared for the morning rush, she made sure her sleeves were pulled down securely, determined to keep her tattoo hidden no matter how warm it got. The cafe was busier than usual for a Tuesday morning, filled with the typical mix of regulars and tourists extending their Memorial Day weekend. Sarah moved through her routine mechanically, taking orders and serving coffee while trying to stay invisible. Everything seemed normal until around 9:30, when she noticed an unusual commotion outside. A black sedan with government plates had pulled up in front of the cafe, followed by 2 additional vehicles. Sarah watched through the window as several people in dress military uniforms stepped out, their movements crisp and purposeful. The sight made her stomach clench with anxiety, wondering if somehow her conversation the night before had gotten her into some kind of trouble. The door chimed as the group entered, led by the same older man she had spoken with the evening before. But now he wasn't wearing casual clothes. Instead, he was dressed in a full marine dress blue uniform, decorated with an impressive array of ribbons and medals. The eagles on his collar clearly marked him as a colonel, and Sarah felt her mouth drop open as she realized who had been sitting in her cafe, listening to her story. The conversation in the cafe died instantly as customers recognized the significance of the uniformed visitors. The colonel walked directly to the counter where Sarah stood frozen, her mind racing to process what was happening. Behind him followed a younger Marine in dress uniform, carrying what appeared to be official documentation and a small wooden box. "Good morning, Sarah," the colonel said in the same kind voice she remembered from the night before. "I believe we have some unfinished business to discuss." The entire cafe was now silent, with every customer and staff member focused on the unexpected military presence. Sarah noticed that some of the people who had made cutting remarks about her tattoo the day before were among the crowd, their faces showing confusion and growing concern. The colonel turned to address the room, his voice carrying the authority of decades of military leadership. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need to share something important with all of you. Yesterday, in this very establishment, I witnessed a young woman being ridiculed and judged for a tattoo on her arm. Comments were made about her character, her patriotism, and her understanding of military service and sacrifice." Sarah felt every pair of eyes in the cafe turned toward her, and her cheeks burned with embarrassment. But the colonel's next words changed everything. "What you don't know," he continued, "is that Sarah Martinez is the sister of Marine Lance Corporal Daniel Martinez, who gave his life serving our country in Afghanistan. The tattoo that some of you found so inappropriate is actually a memorial to her brother and his fallen squad members, designed by Daniel himself before his death." A collective gasp went through the crowd, and Sarah saw several people's faces go pale as they began to understand the magnitude of their misjudgment. The colonel gestured for the younger Marine to step forward. "Staff Sergeant Williams here served with Daniel Martinez in the same battalion, though in a different company. When I made some calls last night to verify Sarah's story, I discovered something remarkable." Staff Sergeant Williams opened the wooden box he had been carrying and removed several items. "Lance Corporal Martinez saved my life," he said in a clear, strong voice. "During the same deployment where he lost his squad members, Danny pulled me from a burning Humvee after we hit an IED on a different patrol. I've been looking for his family for years, hoping to thank them and to deliver these." Sarah's hands trembled as Staff Sergeant Williams handed her the box. Inside were Danny's personal effects that had never made it home, including letters he had written to her that were never sent, and a small American flag that had flown over his forward operating base. "Your brother," Williams continued, "was one of the bravest Marines I ever served with. He earned a Purple Heart for his wounds and was recommended for a Bronze Star with V device for his actions in saving my life. The paperwork got lost in the bureaucracy, but Colonel Henderson here helped us track it down." The colonel nodded and reached into his jacket, removing an official medal case. "Sarah, by the authority vested in me by the United States Marine Corps and the Department of Defense, I am honored to present you with your brother's Bronze Star Medal with Combat 5, awarded posthumously for his heroic actions in Afghanistan." As the colonel opened the case to reveal the gleaming medal, Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. The entire cafe had fallen completely silent, with many people openly crying at the emotional scene unfolding before them. Daniel Martinez epitomized the values we hold most dear, the colonel continued. Honor, courage, commitment, and selfless service to others. His sacrifice, along with that of his fallen brothers Rodriguez, Jenkins, Morrison, and Sergeant Thompson, will never be forgotten. Sarah accepted the medal with shaking hands, overwhelmed by the honor and the validation of her brother's service. But the colonel wasn't finished. He turned back to address the crowd, his expression now stern and commanding. I want everyone in this room to understand something clearly. This young woman has carried the weight of her brother's sacrifice every single day since his death. The tattoo you criticized represents more honor and patriotism than most people will ever possess. She has worked tirelessly to support herself while honoring her brother's memory. And instead of receiving the respect and support she deserves, she was subjected to ignorant judgment and cruel comments. The silence in the cafe was deafening. Sarah could see that several of the people who had made disparaging remarks the day before were now looking at the floor, clearly ashamed of their behavior. Janet Morrison, the woman who had started the whispered comments, stood up slowly from her table. "Sarah," she said, her voice breaking with emotion, "I owe you the deepest apology. We all do. I had no right to judge you or make assumptions about something I didn't understand. Your brother was a hero, and you are honoring his memory in the most beautiful way possible." One by one, other customers began to stand and offer their own apologies. The man who had claimed real veterans don't advertise their service approached Sarah with tears in his eyes. "I served 2 tours," he said quietly, "and I thought I understood sacrifice. But I was wrong to judge you. Your brother gave everything for our country, and you've given everything to keep his memory alive. I'm ashamed of what I said, and I'm sorry." The colonel watched as the reconciliation continued, satisfaction evident in his expression. When the apologies had concluded, he made one final announcement. "I've spoken with the owner of this establishment," he said. "From now on, Sarah's college tuition will be covered through a scholarship fund that my unit maintains for family members of fallen Marines. It's the least we can do for someone who has shown such dedication to honoring our fallen brothers." The crowd erupted in applause, and Sarah found herself surrounded by people who had gone from judging her to celebrating her in less than 24 hours. The transformation was overwhelming, and she struggled to process how dramatically her life had changed. As the crowd began to disperse and the Marines prepared to leave, Colonel Henderson approached Sarah one last time. "Your brother would be proud of the woman you've become," he said softly. "And I hope you'll never again feel like you need to hide that tattoo. It represents something sacred, and you should wear it with pride." Over the following weeks, Sarah's story spread throughout Millbrook and beyond. Local news stations picked up the story, and soon people from across the country were learning about Danny Martinez and his heroic service. The cafe became a gathering place for veterans and military families, all drawn by Sarah's story and her visible commitment to honoring fallen heroes. Sarah never again covered her tattoo at work. Instead, she wore it proudly, and it became a conversation starter with customers who wanted to learn about her brother and his squad members. She found herself becoming an unofficial keeper of their stories, sharing memories and ensuring that their sacrifice was never forgotten. The scholarship allowed Sarah to transfer to a 4-year university where she majored in social work with a focus on helping veterans and military families. She eventually established a non-profit organization in Danny's name, providing support and resources for families of fallen service members. Years later, Sarah would look back on that difficult Memorial Day weekend as the turning point in her life. The day when ignorance and judgment were replaced by understanding and respect, when a community learned the true meaning of sacrifice, and when a Marine colonel's simple act of kindness changed everything. The tattoo remained exactly as it was, a permanent reminder of love, loss, and the unbreakable bonds between those who serve. But now it was no longer something to hide. Instead, it had become a symbol of pride, honor, and the enduring power of truth to overcome prejudice. In the end, Sarah realized that her brother had been right all along. The memorial tattoo wasn't just about honoring the fallen. It was about ensuring that their stories would continue to be told, their sacrifices would never be forgotten, and their legacy would inspire others to serve with the same courage and dedication they had shown. Through her visible commitment to their memory, Sarah had become a living testament to the values they had died defending.